Hey everyone, my name is Daniel, and in this video I'm going to be walking you through this commissioned illustration I did about a cozy Seattle apartment. We'll take a look at the process, some tips and tricks, and I'll also be answering a Q&A I got on my Instagram throughout the video. So for some backstory for the illustration, I had a client who was moving into a new apartment and she wanted me to paint her favorite spot in her old one, which was overlooking the Seattle skyline. And then from there she would turn these into a high quality print and frame it. So she sent me a whole bunch of reference images and I took those and turned it into these sketches here. I basically wanted to show her after a day of work, feet up and feeling super relaxed. So she ended up picking the one she liked the most, which had a good blend of interior versus exterior, and I got to work. To save a lot of time, I hopped into Blender and modeled a basic view of her apartment, as well as some of the buildings in the background to establish perspective. I'm mainly positioning the buildings to fit the illustration, but I'm also keeping in mind the different landmarks that were actually part of a view to make it feel like Seattle. And then as you can see, I've also got my camera perspective set up, and then from there, I'll take a render, which looks like this, and then bring it into Photoshop. And basically now I'm tracing over everything line art style in order just to get the general perspective and everything like that. So a lot of the props that I'm drawing are very basic and they're kind of blocked out in different cubes and very simple shapes. And as you can see here, I am just adding in extra details like, plants and little Bulbasaur. It's just usually drawing all of the things that I didn't want to spend time modeling. And when working with a 3D to overpainting workflow, it depends, the more you spend time in 3D, the less you'll have to do painting, or the less time you spend in 3D, the more time you'll have to do in painting. So it's really just like a push and pull, and it really depends on, first of all, the project, what kinds of things you're meant to be doing, how complex the scene is, and because of this one, it was a huge Seattle skyline, I really needed to make sure that my proportions and perspective were correct. Once my kind of draft lines are done, I'll move in and clean everything up a little bit. Now, in the end for this illustration, I don't end up showing the lines, but it does help me figure out tertiary shapes and extra details like how the folds would look on the character, what kinds of materials and desk details there are. And then from there, as you can see, I'm moving on to the flatting stage, where I'm basically just giving everything its base layer and base color, and making sure my selections are very separate so I can go ahead and add clipping masks on top of everything. Now I'm just finalizing a lot of the desk details, and then from there I'll go ahead and actually start rendering and painting things out. Now I did ask on my Instagram for a Q&A, so thanks everybody who sent questions in. The first one is by Steve Graphics Artist, who asks, do you use texture in your illustrations, and any tips for getting your artwork in the freelance world? So great question. I'm actually going to show you an example right now of how I use texture, and I've created a rectangular marquee selection and I'm just drawing different lines in there with a textured brush and then warping it using free transform and then making sure it fits over the desk. So it's easier doing it this way, like flat, and then applying it in perspective than drawing all of the lines. And from there, I actually just go ahead and add little bits and pieces of detail, as you can see here, little bits of chips, and maybe some color variations and, the way the wood grain is moving and just things like that, basically. But a lot of the texture I do apply in my illustrations are important for showing the kind of material and also just adding a bit of character and story to a lot of the items that you see. Now, as for tips for getting freelance work, I would really say that social media is to be leveraged here. I can only speak for myself personally, but I started getting freelance work when I took Instagram and YouTube a little bit more seriously, and I was able to actually have a portfolio that people could see online. Reddit was actually also a really great place that I found commissions, and you can browse different subreddits and then just post things that you're really into. At least for me, a lot of my cozy illustrations ended up taking off a little bit, and that's how I got some work. But it does take a bit of time, especially to build up that portfolio, but you'll find that once you start the ball rolling, it's fairly easy to continue that and actually find more work as a result of just knowing people that are looking for artists. The second question I got was from Isaiah Draws, who asks, how did you get into art? Now, this is an interesting one because for me, like many people, I grew up drawing and being creative and everything, but I think I leaned more towards that at a young age. And I was always interested in things like drama and media and, music, everything like that. When I started doing art, seriously and professionally, it was when I finished Games Art and Design, which was my degree at university. And from there, I kind of realized that I really liked illustration, not so much concept art, because I could spend 30 hours on a painting, but drawing like 200 iterations of armor just felt really boring to me, if I'm being honest. So once I figured that out, I spent a lot of time researching and getting my skills up and taking it, as seriously as possible, and just showing up and painting as much as I could. And that was really what opened the door for me in terms of work opportunities and things like that, was just spending the time getting my fundamentals up. And it's always going to be a lifelong process anyway, but you don't need to be a complete master to be a professional. And realizing that was actually quite empowering, because you get to a certain level and it's like you can start making money off of your art, and that's always a really, really rewarding kind of feeling. It's like all of your hard work finally like literally paying off. And yeah, it was definitely a turning point for me. Now, I just want to turn your attention back to the illustration for a second, because I got a question from Milk Laced who asks, how did you draw so many windows without getting tired? Now, I'm going to plug a video I made a while ago called How to Paint Buildings Spider-Verse Style, because it goes over the nitty-gritty details of how I actually do this. But in the time lapse, you can see I'm creating very simple shapes for all of the windows. And just like the desk I made earlier, it's going to be flat, and then I'll warp it in perspective, as you can see. The thing with windows and buildings, it's like they're so complex, there's so many different details, so you really have to find a simple way of showing all of that and implying a lot of things, and that's a key word that I want you to realize here. So when I'm painting this particular building, once I've got the horizontal bands across, which will represent lights in different floors, I'll go in and add a clipping mask and then paint very loose, abstract kind of shapes, random colors. I'm also thinking about the reflection, and whenever I need to, I make textures like these, just random shapes and cubes, and usually I want it to be a little bit more cohesive and flat and square, because in buildings obviously there's a lot of right angles. But it's also really about taking it slowly, and you don't have to rush the process, as long as you kind of think about the most efficient way possible of representing a building and looking at all the different nuances. Like in this one, for instance, they're more apartment style buildings than that massive corporate one I just did. So there's going to be, especially seeing the roof, a lot of different aircon units, pipes, and all sorts of things. And I'm really just using the same method again, making a shape, warping it into place. And this entire thing is quite a tedious process, I'm not going to lie, because there is a lot. But if you consider actual buildings, how long it would take to construct them, when we represent it with art, it's going to be not similar, but because there's more details, there's more painting. I hope that makes sense. So I would recommend listening to some good music, putting on a podcast or something like that, and just going for it, and really just focusing on one building at a time and then moving on to the next one. We also have another question from Eliz Beezer, who asks, what have you done to help your art/creative block? Oh boy, this is an interesting one, because I feel like for everybody it's going to be different. For me personally, whenever I am feeling some kind of burnout or just creative block, it helps to remove yourself from the situation. Sometimes you do just have to take a break and move on to either other projects. For me, because I do YouTube as well, when I get into editing, that is really fulfilling for me creatively, and I don't have to think about like painting or creating something new. But I think honestly, it does help also realizing persistence instead of perfection. And I try to live by that, especially with the later projects I've been doing this year, because just showing up and putting in the time, you feel like you're frustrated with a painting and maybe you're not getting it the way that you want, but just because you showed up to that day, that's already something to celebrate. And sometimes you really just need to draw for fun. Turn off any kind of expectation. Don't think about posting it on Instagram or creating content out of it, but just finding and falling back in love with what made it so appealing in the first place really does help. But apart from that, like if brute forcing it doesn't necessarily work, I would say for me, exercise is something that really does help too. Getting good sleep, making sure my diet is okay, because usually if I have some kind of creative block, it's not just the creative block that's going on in my life. It's usually other things too. and so I have to go and attend to them and then get back to it, and then it all kind of like moves together, if that makes any sense. But yeah, great question. So back to the illustration, one thing that I do want to point out here is that reflections are super big in painting any kind of cityscape. Something I found that really helps enhance your art and pushes it, to the next level is when you're showing things that are outside of the frame, and reflections are a really great way of doing that. So I'm just implying, that there's a bit of a sunset going on, that there are other buildings going on that catch the reflection in the windows, and just really giving them the love and care that they need. So yeah, this is Seattle is actually very beautiful. When I was looking at all of the reference photos that my client sent me, and I also went into Google Maps just to figure out exactly the layout of the street and everything like that, and also what kind of buildings surrounded her, just so I could make sure I was representing it the best way that I could. As we get further in the distance, you can see that I painted a small crane just because I noticed that Seattle always has some kind of cranes going on in the skyline and adding buildings and painting it. But a lot of my shapes become very abstract and very textured, and I'm using a lot of this to imply things like foliage and trees, houses in the far distance, maybe some of the suburbs. And as soon as I start adding small tiny lights, as well as the glow from the streets below, it really does sell that kind of feeling. And because you have a couple of buildings that are really close to the camera that are detailed, your brain naturally extends that further on the more that we get the same elements, meaning windows, lights, and everything like that. A really big challenge during this illustration was this specific building right here, because it was circular. My usual method of painting it like a big square or rectangle wouldn't really be applicable, so I want to show you how I did that. So we're back in Blender, and I made sure that I took that building and made it very low poly, almost like an octagon, and then took the render and then brought it back into Photoshop. So it is kind of, I am treating it a little bit like a square, but I'm really just doing it this way to get the planes of orientation. And then from there, I'm going to free transform my windows and just align it to these different planes. So when I remove it all, it has that effect of being circular. And I tried a whole bunch of different methods. Initially I tried warping it, but it was just way too hard to control. And this was the easiest method I could come up with. The first time I did this, I noticed that these windows are massive. They're really, really big. So I just made it a bit smaller and then copied and pasted it down like so. And from there, I'll hit Control T, go into free transform, and make sure that all of the planes are lining up nicely. So just spending a bit of time and making sure that I have this here. Once I turn off the 3D render, you can see that effect. And then from there, I'll go ahead and mask out those bottom windows so they're not showing through. So it was very, challenging, but once I had it down, it was just back to business, back to painting a regular building like so. And now back to another question I got on my Instagram. Guire Max asks, should you listen to all advice/criticism on your art, or is it okay to ignore those who don't know what they are talking about? Now this is a very, very interesting topic because there are a whole bunch of nuances here that I want to get into. So the first one is, as artists, yes, you should absolutely learn how to take criticism and kind of remove that personal feeling that you have with your art, because sometimes people do have legitimate points. But it's like, how do you know if their points are actually valid? And that's, the whole question here. I think it tends to become a bit harmful when you take advice everywhere, because everyone's going to have an opinion. And usually with art, a lot of people find that it's easier to give advice because drawing's so accessible, like when we were kids, we all drew, so we kind of have an understanding of how it works. But to grow as an artist and to really not let that advice harm you, I would really say, is the person you're asking, do you like their work, if they're an artist as well? Can they actually do things, and can they actually help you in a constructive way? When it comes to people that maybe don't really know art, sometimes the general public also does have good points, because we're so caught up in the technical side of it, we forget, well, does it actually look good, first of all? Even though I'm doing something that might be quote-unquote true to reality, does it actually have appeal? You can kind of suss out the person's intention that's giving you art, and if you find yourself really disagreeing with them, take a step back, have a look, is this actually fair? Am I actually being fair on this person? Do they have a point? And especially if the criticism they're giving you is unsolicited, meaning you didn't ask for it, you don't have to take that on board at all. When you're asking for critique, you're trying to be self-critical about your art, And if you do realize, like, you know, for me personally, my characters aren't necessarily the best. So when I am asking for advice for people, I will ask them, you know, do these characters look realistic? You know, what can I improve with my proportions? And you're creating that safe kind of space to receive criticism rather than just sort of listening to everyone who wants to comment on your work. And finally, the last question I got was by Divan Unaki. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but they ask, will you ever make a video using heavy paint or deeper in depth on Alberto Mielgo's work? Absolutely, I definitely want to do that. And on my channel, you know, the two of my best videos are how to paint building Spider-Verse style and also the Spider-Verse analysis. So people are interested in learning how graphic reduction works, and I want to show that in a way that isn't just Spider-Verse. You know, it's like how you can apply that to painting and seeing things in your real life or by references. So yeah, absolutely, in the future I'll be doing that at some point. And now finally, I want to run you through the small time lapse here of the illustration. So overall, this took 24 hours from start to finish, from planning and sketches and everything like that into the final render. If you are tackling a cityscape like this as well, don't rush, take your time, put on some good music, look at a lot of references, and try things out just to see whatever works best for your workflow. Overall, I found this illustration actually I was in the mood, the groove for this one, right? So when I was painting it from start to finish, I found it just super easy and really relaxing. And you know, the client really liked it as well, which makes me even more happy. And I just got to really tackle a scene that was very fun and very lo-fi as well, which is, you know, always what I'm going for. So I do hope this one helped you out, and that's going to bring us to the end of this video. If you do have any questions of your own, please let me know in the comments down below or on my Instagram at DanielAngArt. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.